Good afternoon. My name is Ike Barnes. I'm with the Secret Service, and I run the Colorado Electronic Crimes Task Force. Our model is a public-private academic partnership where we all come together and fight cybersecurity. And because this is not a me problem, this is not a you problem, this is not a they problem, this is an us problem. So without all of us collaborating our resources together, sharing information, and talking cross-sector about what the threats are and what some possible solutions are, we aren't going to help solve this problem. And I just want to go back. There was a question over here in the last section that asked, what are the different threat actors? If I heard it correctly, I didn't hear it all, but there's a lot of different reports out there. Symantec's a great report. Carbon Black has reports, Verizon has reports, everybody has fantastic reports. But if you look at some of the stats over time, and I generally put people into three categories, right? You have the cyber criminal. What does a cyber criminal want to do? Well, they just want to take any data that you've got and monetize it and steal it. Then you've got the nation state type actor. And what are they looking for? They're looking for any intellectual property that you have as a general rule that they can steal, that they don't have to develop themselves. And then you have this other group over here that I call the activist. And the activist, they want to just disrupt you because they're pissed off at something you have done, some perceived good or perceived bad that they're against. So that's what they're going to go after. And over time, when you kind of look at those three groups, about 80% of all attacks are roughly the criminal actor. About 20% of all attacks are roughly the nation-state actor, and about 1 to 2% of all attacks is roughly your activist. So that just kind of over a large period of time, and those numbers will ebb and flow every year. That's just kind of what the stats bear out. But thank you.
Hi, is it working? Okay. My name's Julie Chikillo. I currently work for a company called Beeline. I won't talk too much about it, but basically it's a company online that the Fortune 500 use to manage their contingent workforce, which basically means contractors. Prior to Beeline, I did actually spend 15 years working in the state and federal space, so I'm very familiar with some of the trials and tribulations of being in that space. And I think that's it about me and the company.
My name is Randall Fritchie. I go by Fritz, sometimes Sergeant Fritz, depends on the situation. I'm the CISO for Denver Health. We are a pseudo-government agency. We're actually called a subdivision of the state of Colorado and a body corporate, which I'm not sure I understand what that means, but we use it to our benefit when we can. I've been doing this about 20 years. Before I came into cybersecurity and IT, I was in law enforcement. I was a deputy sheriff in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm also a distinguished fellow with the Information Systems Security Association, ISSA. Anybody a member? Oh my gosh, you've got to join the ISSA. Just a small pitch there. I also teach for Harvard cybersecurity risk management course, and I am also with Greg, affiliate professor at Regis University. And so happy to be here today. Thanks for being here.
Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. We'll start out with the interesting one. Last year, the Colorado Department of Transportation was hit by a ransomware attack. I'm sure that comes as a shock to everybody. How have attacks like that and the ones affecting the cities of Atlanta and Baltimore colored your organization's understanding of possible threats and threat prevention? I'll start with Ike here.
So to go back to our talk from Symantec, right? We, the bad guys, are looking for what is successful, and we're going to use his term, rinse and repeat, right? So if it's successful and I can get in and it's publicized, I'm going to continue to do that, right? My concern for you all is what are the vectors of attack? And how am I addressing those said vectors? Now, one of the things that we've seen lately, and this all went back to quite frankly, the Target credit card breach, where I got into a vendor and use those vendors' credentials to then move laterally into my actual target organization and see what it was. So in addition to the phishing stuff that you should obviously be concerned about and be dealing with, you also need to think about who your vendors are, what type of access do they have to your network, and can they launch an attack, they, the bad guys, launch an attack from your vendor network into your network. It's something that, to steal a phrase from Carbon Black, they're calling island hopping now, right? And I think their stat that they're seeing on this is almost 50% of all attacks are utilizing some sort of island hopping, so it's coming from some trusted known source into your network. So
I like the island hopping. So I do know some of the staff that actually had to work on that CDOT ransomware attack, but I would say before that even happened, ransomware was definitely on the radar a couple of years ago. So we were very proactive, picked an antivirus that we could test regularly against ransomware that either came out in the news or we could find. So we do spend time testing that off the network. Don't plug the laptop into the network and then test it. So I'd say we're just actively testing for what we see in the wild. A lot of have one person dedicated to the threat intelligence, and if we see something come in, we might start testing, or just generally trying to track down, do we have anything in the environment that might be susceptible to the attack?
Yeah, I agree with that. In government agencies in general, we're pathetically funded for our cybersecurity and totally understaffed. We don't have 50 people on our IT security teams. We may have an IT staff that tries to do security, but that lack of funding and that lack of ability to have the support for cybersecurity operations really puts us all at a big risk. So I'm lucky at Denver Health. We have great support. We're able to have those tools, layered tools, really advanced tools, and really, even with a really small team, have those folks be, the Army Rangers of cybersecurity, right? They are going to get in, even though we have all those cool tools. They're going to get in, and we have to be able to have people who can, talking about NIST again, identify, detect, and respond and recover from those attacks that will happen. I tell the board, it's not if, it's when. Although we have all this great stuff, we have to be ready. Something that I read recently said that the advanced persistent threat, on average, takes 19 minutes. And as Thomas said earlier, 191 days to detect that you've been breached. That's way too long. So instead of 19 minutes, I want it to be 9 minutes, right? I want to have more automation, so when they come in, I can have some automation around that, reduce that time, keep on reducing that time, because once they get in and they embed themselves in there, you're never going to find them until the FBI calls you and said, hey, you've been breached, right? You don't want that call. So that's identify that NIST framework for your organization, get those tools in there, just keep working to build those relationships necessary so that you can get the funding and the team or the external MSSP to help support your operations.
Can I add one thing? So one thing I would say that I think is critical that tends to be overlooked from the cybersecurity or the security side is that a lot of these issues are stemming from legacy environments that aren't patchable, they're out of date. So one of the things that's really, really important in the security, if you're on the security team or you're supporting security, is make sure you understand, is there funding for these legacy environments? Help the team who's getting that funding go and get funding. Because you're coming in and saying, if they're just saying, hey, we need better equipment, it doesn't sound as good as, hey, I need better equipment because this could be compromised at any point in time, we can't patch it. So I do find that liaising with the teams that have these problems, because if you go to the team and say, hey, I need you to patch this, and they're looking at you like, that's great, I have no funding, I don't have the team, and it's not patchable, then you're both in a bad situation. So alongside with just keeping up on the NIST and all of the threats out there. Make sure you understand the environment. If it's not patchable, it's legacy. Make sure you're working with the teams that need to go out and get the funding to upgrade the infrastructure.
So in healthcare, does anybody work in healthcare? Thank you. You're lucky. So our two critical risks are our imaging system. So when you come in the hospital, you get a CT scan on your brain or an X-ray. All those are images that are sent into a system called PACS. And PACS stores the images, and then the doctors can read the images and use those to diagnose what's wrong with you. If that PACS system gets compromised, let's say you get ransomware that encrypts all of that image data, and we can't read images, you can't come to our hospital anymore. We cannot treat you if we can't image you, right? So if we get ransomware in our PACS, it's about $3,000, I forgot the math, $3,000 a minute, something crazy. That's $25 million a week. So we can't treat you, we're diverting to other hospitals. Our ambulances are taking you to different hospitals because we get ransomware. That's a bad day for us. It's a bad week. It's almost an existential threat to our hospital. Also, people could die because if it takes an extra 10 minutes to divert you, and that 10 minutes could be critical in saving your life. So that is a bad situation. The other thing is biomed devices. Biomed devices are like the IV pumps or the MRI machines or the CT scanners. Those are things that are federally regulated, and it's really hard to patch them. And traditionally, they have not been built with security in mind. But biomed devices are really one of the few areas where you can kill somebody with a cybersecurity attack. That's kind of scary to have to secure. So what do you do there? Well, if you can't patch it, you can't change the default password of, password 123, what do? Well, you just have to really isolate it. So if you can't secure it, you have to secure it by putting it on its own island, right? You have to understand what ports, protocols, IP addresses, whatever it needs to talk to, and then nothing else. So you put a layer 3 filtering in front of that thing, so the only thing that gets in and out is what you let come in and out and nothing else. I always talk about, especially for PACS, ransomware. How does ransomware propagate? Ransomware usually gets on a system, somebody failed a phishing, they clicked it, and then they get ransomware, and then it's there and it's trying to find other places to encrypt. And what does it usually use? It's called the SMB, right? SMB is what you use when you browse the network for a file share. Well, ransomware does the same thing. If it finds something that you have access to on the network, next thing you know, that's what's getting encrypted. So why should I be able to browse file shares in my PACS system, right? Why do I need to be able to browse the file shares? Because now ransomware can do the same thing. So why do you even allow SMB into your PACS? So those are the types of things that, just like Julie said, you got to understand your systems, understand what the needs are, what the threats are, and then you can actually work to limit that to a great degree.
So I'm going to just take what Randall said, and Randall absolutely clearly articulated what his crown jewels are. And not only did he clearly articulate, he understood how his crown jewels worked and how that then impacts his business operations, and then what defenses I need to put in place around it. So for all of you, the key here is being able to that precisely articulate what my crown jewel is. And it's far too easy for all of us to say, well, everything. No, it's not everything. There are 2 or 3 items that every organization has. It may only be one that is your crown jewel of data. So then with that, what systems is that data residing on? How are those systems interacting with your other systems? And what do I need to do to protect myself so that that data is not corrupted?
Great stuff from the panelists. They've actually went through 2 or 3 questions before I even got to ask them. Just out of curiosity here, does anyone have the privilege of not having legacy equipment? Every once in a while, I get somebody raise their hand, so I'm just curious. Now, I don't work in a state agency, for the state agency, under any state or government or federal agencies at all. And everything they've described here, I deal with on a daily basis. So I don't know if it's a case of misery loves company, but the corporate world's in the same boat. Now, speaking of legacy, I'm going to jump to the exact opposite of that. We've all heard of things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain. How has it at all had any impact on your day-to-day work? And I'll start with you, Julie.
I'm in a misery on this one. So a couple years ago, so I work for, Beeline is pretty much a technology company, so a huge development shop. A couple years ago, the developers decided to move into what's called DevOps. I'm sure you guys have seen the buzz on this. They broke every one of my security tools that I owned. I was a little frustrated. So the technology, the fast pace in the development world has definitely impacted me. Even today, as I look to the vendors, the security world, the security vendors have not kept up. I started cold calling vendors for 6 months, trying to find anything that I could use in this automated pipeline. And even today, I think we're 2 to 3 years outside of that. I'm still struggling because the return on the security response has to be 15 minutes or less. So your 24-hour Veracode scan, out. And so that's been my biggest problem. The other problem is we're not seeing a lot of, there's not a lot in the industry to secure the containers, so I won't get too deep into the technology, but there's very little to secure containers, scan the containers, monitor the containers. As your pipeline's moving, if you're deploying daily into production, and so you're having to get feedback to the developers, your code's bad, in under 15 minutes, these containers go up and down just as fast. So that's been my big headache.
I was just going to toss something in there with the containers. We can chat later. I deal with that on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, it's entertaining.
The other thing with containers, and this is sort of I don't remember who had the point there about how long people can stay in your network, is containers are short-lived. And whether you say a container or a Lambda function, any of this nice technical stuff, it's all the same. What happens when it comes up, does its one thing, and goes away? What happens if it comes up, does its one thing, sends out some ransomware stuff, and then goes down? Can you track that?
It's a very difficult problem right now. Yeah, we're struggling with that. Or the logging, so that's been the big question is how do you trace an incident back as we talk about incidents? Where was the starting point? And as you move from, if you have several clouds in your environment, I don't know how progressive the state or locals have become on that topic, but as you move, and if you have one cloud, let's say you have AWS, and your developers are now like, well, what's the difference? I'll move to Azure. I'll have Google. So you have 3 or 4 clouds in your environment and trying to trace back, because the other problem is that if you're using native security tools on these clouds, you've got 4 panes of glass there, plus your internal on-prem network. Tracing back where the problem started is very difficult, and so I'd say that's probably my biggest issue today.
Me? So, first of all, blockchain, we have a rule, if you say blockchain, you have to be quiet for 5 minutes. But, so when I talked about reducing the time to detect and respond from 19 minutes to 9 minutes, or from 191, right? We have those really great folks who are trained, but if they don't know about it, or when they get that alert and they have to spend 15, 20 minutes building that threat intelligence just to understand what they're looking at. So that's where we're looking at new technology called SOAR, which is supposed to be AI, which is most often just a bunch of scripts that the vendor wrote and sold you for $100,000. But really true SOAR is supposed to, the promise of it is, when they get an alert into that tool will do those 10 steps that your analyst would do, because they're just manual steps. I got to go to VirusTotal, check out the reputation of the URL or the IP address. I've got to go in this particular system or the Active Directory log and see when that account was logging in or what it did on the network. All that stuff is just manual stuff that analyst has to spend 10, 15, 20 minutes doing up front. So for me, the promise of SOAR is let that tool go do all those manual things anyway, whether it's a script or really AI, let it go do that. And then when my analyst gets that, it's a threat intelligence package. So as soon as he gets the alert, all that stuff's already been done automatically, and he gets that package. Now, he hits the ground running instantly as soon as he gets that alert. That can reduce our time to detect and respond to a great degree. That's for us really what I'm driving us towards. The other area of AI, it's probably really AI. So I'm also in charge of the privacy function for our hospital, and we have a tool called Fair Warning. And what Fair Warning is supposed to do is monitor the activity in your EMR, electronic medical record, and it's supposed to say, well, if you looked at a chart of somebody at your address, you're probably snooping on your husband or your wife or something like that. Or on the same street, I'm snooping on my neighbor. I saw the ambulance come to his house. Now I want to see what happened to him. Now I'm going to go look in his chart when you don't have any business being in his chart. So the promise of Fair Warning always was, we're going to let you know when those types of things happen. But for me, those 2 or 3 unique situations, for the money we pay for that tool, is not a real good return on investment. So now we're seeing tools coming out that not only do those types of things, but they'll also look at context. So I'm an emergency room nurse, and I never leave the emergency room, but all of a sudden I start checking out a chart from our West Side clinic. This tool will go, whoops, wait a minute. You've never looked at a chart outside of there, but all of a sudden you're looking at a West Side clinic. Or maybe you work in peds, but you're checking out, 60-year-old person. So it'll detect anomalies from the baseline behavior, and it'll flag you and give you that context. Next thing you know, I can see, Mary Jane looked at, sorry I said Mary Jane in Colorado. Mary Jane looked at a chart. Number 1, she'd never worked in that clinic before. Number 2, that's not her specialty. Number 3, she's a repeat offender. All of a sudden, you start getting that context right there on your screen, and now instead of calling a manager, hey, is Mary Jane, well, I got an alert, is Mary Jane working that clinic? I have no idea. All of a sudden, because this system is looking at the baseline behavioral behavior of each individual person, all of a sudden I get context. I don't have to call around and try to build context. I'm presented with context from the beginning. Now I can say this is very likely an incident of snooping in a chart, which can be a HIPAA violation for us.
So both Julie and Randall talked about threat hunting, right? And how am I hunting both the insider who's in my system doing stuff, as well as the outsider who gets into my system, right? And Symantec brought up threat hunting, right? So I've got to deal with actively searching out what the threats are. Now to go back to the original, the legacy systems, unfortunately we're all dealing with legacy systems, and because we all looked at computers at one point in time as a one-time capital expenditure and we moved on. But we have to update our stuff regularly, right? And there's several different ways and techniques and methods that you can do with this. One of them is, quite frankly, outsource everything, right? And go to a complete cloud environment. What are you doing with there? Well, I mean, you are taking advantage of economies of scales and some of these other larger corporations that have other mechanisms that are built into it, in addition to what other vendor you may have that you layer on your environment. What's the problem with that? Well, I mean, one of the big risks is you then completely lose control of your data. And it deals with another whole subset of what that data is, and can you live with where that data may actually end up residing, right? So there's pros and cons to this. But nonetheless, I would I would offer that we have to collectively kind of come together, and instead of looking at ourselves, especially in government, as singular silos, I am this county, or I am that city, and I am this, and we all have our own networks, and we're all doing our own security. Is it perhaps time for us collectively, in groups, to come together to say, hey, why don't we pool this all together so that we all have this sort of same managed set of risks, right? And then we all put our resources in together, and we take that wall, and I loved the wall that was on the slide, and move it from here, and now suddenly, even though I'm a small city, I'm a group of small cities, and now I've got a wall that looks more similar to the New York City wall, right? Is that a more efficient use of our taxpayers' resources? Just a thought. There's pros and cons to it, no doubt about it, but certainly a conversation worth having.
Agreed. Great advice from everybody. Sort of building on what Ike just said, I'm going to kind of open it up and see if anyone has any questions, or I guess we have one here already.
Yes, I work at the American Red Cross doing some program management. We run into a pretty unique problem where we have, it sounds funny, quite literally thumb drives from, thank you. So yeah, I work as a program manager at the American Red Cross, and I run into a pretty unique problem on a very regular basis, where I'm either having to let people use their own computers to access our systems, as well as having more thumb drives entering computers within the building than I can even fathom. So how would you manage that risk? Because we have had issues in the past, and as a result, a lot of our IT people have they almost have a coronary whenever they have to think about putting somebody else's thumb drive into their laptop.
Well, I can just say real quickly that HR tells me tasers are frowned on, so I need another approach.
So in a hospital environment, we have, and we're also a teaching hospital. So all of our doctors have to be professors at University of Colorado, and they want to put thumb drives in and use them and share presentations and everything. They want to image a patient, and they want to stick it on a thumb drive so they can take it home and do homework with it, right? It's a very unique but very challenging environment. So, but if somebody sticks a thumb key into a computer and gets patient data on it, and then they go to Walmart and falls out of their pocket, we have a HIPAA breach. So we have to have a safe harbor, which is encryption. So if you stick a thumb key in a system at Denver Health, it automatically encrypts the thumb key. So we're safe from that perspective. But then from just getting the malware on there, you almost have to just force it to be read-only, right? So it can't write to your system if you have malware on there. Another thing you could do is turn off auto run. So just a GPO setting, you turn off auto run, and if there's malware on there, it's relying on the system to default auto run. So you plug it in, and next thing you know, it just goes crazy. If you disable auto run and you stick it in there, it won't be able to do anything unless you actually physically execute it. So make it read-only by default, encrypt it if you can, but the support of the organization is really the most important thing. They have to understand why it's such a big risk. They're not in IT, they don't care, but you got to explain to them in their business terms why this is a big risk for us, and here's what we need to do to fix it. Here's what it'll cost. We've done the analysis. Here's the impact that we would expect from this, and overall that effort or that cost or impact is worth it because here's the risk.
I've nothing to add to that. That was well said.
Any other question? Oh, right over there.
You mentioned, this is for Randall, you mentioned imaging as being one of the big problems in the medical field. It has been reported lately that Medtronic devices, which are implants, for instance, for people with diabetes, automatically provide through the cellular network information, and those can be hacked. Where do you see this going?
So thanks for bringing up my worst nightmare. Yeah, so today we have pacemakers that talk Bluetooth. Thankfully, Bluetooth is a local protocol, so I have to be at some physical proximity to you to actually break your pacemaker, but that is really a big deal. for me, luckily, you're going to have to be sitting in the hospital for it. Now, if you go home and the guy comes to your house and he's got a Bluetooth hack, yeah, you're probably in trouble. The manufacturers understand how big of a risk that is. It's truly an existential threat because somebody can die. So they're really putting in protocols, but you can only secure Bluetooth to a point. So I think with 5G, it's going to get even scarier because now your Bluetooth's going to be, or your pacemaker or your brain implant or something is going to be a lot more susceptible because it's going to be another Internet of Things device, right, just out there on the internet. So as a healthcare organization, but specifically as a healthcare device manufacturer, we have to be better at building those things with security in mind from the beginning. Because as we get to that 5G and the IoT world, all of a sudden people are going to start dying. So they've thought about that and they've started to build those things more securely. And I think I've seen increased federal regulation around medical devices and medical implants. And they're really, I think until they regulate it, it's never going to change. So that regulation is getting better and better. And at some point we'll have, hopefully before it ever becomes a reality, we'll have that. Now I haven't seen anybody die yet. Maybe somebody else has, but thankfully that it's more of a local threat, and manufacturers are getting better at that, right?
So just on that very question, right? Well, again, what Randall's talking about here is security by design. So for each one of you, as you're going back to your communities and your organizations, and you're thinking about your own systems, you have to build in security by design as your protocol. And then you're helping utilize these frameworks like the NIST framework or the FFIEC framework or whatever framework it is that out there that floats your boat. I really don't care. Use a framework. Having said that, oftentimes if we see the framework said, okay, do X, Y, and Z. Okay, I did X, Y, and Z, I'm good. I'm tell you, anybody who does X, Y, and Z is a fail, right? Mm-hmm. You may pass the audit, but you're running to a lowest common denominator, right? You need to take and understand if I do X, Y, and Z, that's great, but does that also then mean that I need to do Q, R, and S, right? And if I do Q, R, and S, what extra security am I getting from which threat actor, and is it worth my investment? So being able to clearly articulate back what my crown jewels are, who my threat actors are, what techniques that they're using, and then identifying the tools to protect me in that environment, because resources are not infinite, and I get that, but we need to be able to do that, and it all goes back to the concept of security by design.
I completely agree with that security by design comment. I mean, part of my job is convincing developers that security isn't something that you do a Veracode scan in just before you put it into production.
Yeah.
So it's that whole thing that security is not just there at deployment or even at writing of code, but when somebody in marketing has this brilliant flash in the shower at 3 a.m. and they come in and they say, hey, this is this great idea. Okay, let's put security on there as well. That's when it really needs to start. But anyway, I digress.
So I'll add on to that really quick. So I know most of you probably aren't impacted by GDPR, maybe some of you are, but one of the concepts of GDPR is privacy by design. I'm also the privacy officer at my company. So one of the things that's helped is that, especially if you deal with developers at all, when you're talking about privacy by design or security by design, is you need to understand the life cycle. This goes for any project. And what we've started doing is writing definitions of done or acceptable use for privacy and security. And so these are things that if you have standard language, you have to speak the language of the people you're talking to. And if you can do that and help them understand that this is part of your process, it's not an add-on, it's not on top, it's part of your life cycle. And so having that conversation, building the relationships to where you can say, as a part of your life cycle, you need to do this. This is part of your definition of done, and you can take that out of the development and take it to any of your technology people. But I think that's really helped what we're doing.
Okay. So with that, I see your time is just about up. So I was just going to give everyone about 30 seconds to wrap up, or do you want to do a question? One more question?
Real quick. Todd? Okay. My name is Alan. Forget the last name. I have a small aerospace company in Lafayette. We build military drones, big ones. And it's an interesting, I have 2 points. One is, what is the percentage of situations where a breach has been detected, but it's too late? In other words, yep, we got breached, damage is already done. And then the second one is, I like analogies. We're in a world of the Great Wall of China versus a castle. The Great Wall of China has many breach points, and that's where we're faced with today. I'm curious why there isn't more of a direction towards castles, independent, very large, but very powerful, small environments that have data super protected that corporations, businesses can utilize so that the core of the information that's suspect is in an impervious castle versus we're trying to incorporate a protected wall around everything, and that just invites more breach points.
Answer that?
I was just going to toss out, if you have about 3 or 4 hours, I could probably give you a good answer to your last question. But I'll turn it over here to the...
I was going to say that there is no impervious today. If I have to give a user access to it, or if I have to plug into the internet, all bets are off. It's never going to be impervious. Somebody is always going to be smarter than me. What I have to do really is forget about that perimeter methodology and make data the actual perimeter, right? I've got to understand the data, and I've got to apply security controls, which might be a firewall, it might be user access control, might be privileged access control, but apply that to the data itself. So inventory the data, categorize, classify the data itself, and then apply appropriate security controls to that data depending on the sensitivity of the data or the classification of the data in government's words. So really, my firewall's always going to be there, but I've got to understand that even if it's an insider, somebody is going to have access to that data. So where's my data? What kind of data is it? What level of sensitivity or classification is the data? And now let's apply the appropriate control. Because, you know, I always say I have a server with a spreadsheet. And this is the vendor we buy our toilet paper from. That's a lot different than the EMR where I have all my patient charts in, right, forever. And I have to understand the differences in the sensitivity of that data, apply appropriate controls here, and here I don't care so much, right? So I can actually save money and use it appropriately.
So I'm going to go right back to this. I'm going to play off what Randall said, and I'm going to play off a comment I made earlier, right? We all have to be able to identify, again, what it is our crown jewels are, what data it is that is an existential threat to our organization if we lose control of that data. And we need to build our network design around that and make sure that we understand that one aspect. For years, all of us looked at, oh, if I just put up my Great Wall of China, my Great Firewall, and I keep people from coming in, then I'm good to go. And we had an open, free forum inside of our networks. And many networks are designed that way. And so I can just flow in between it. So as a bad guy, I find one vulnerability in your wall, and now I can move everywhere. Right? So I have to design my networks and my protocols all around it, identifying what the crown jewels are, and then moving out from there and understanding how I protect that piece of information. The other piece I cannot take for granted is endpoint security. And endpoint, right? And I shudder to think about Randall, right? How many endpoints are on his network, right? But I guarantee you, if you sat down and asked Randall the question, Randall can tell you what every endpoint is on his network. Not only that, he can tell you what every piece of software is on his network and how it interacts with one another, right? So if I don't understand those types of things, then I can't really adequately protect my data security, right? So I've got to understand where my endpoints are, where I'm touching stuff that creates an external vulnerability and how the bad guys may move in, and then into my network, how do I'm protecting stuff so that bad guys can't move laterally through and just exploit everything you have.
So I'll speak quickly. I know we're over time. Two things. One, I would look into something called Zero Trust if you haven't done that already. And that's so nobody's trusted on your network, basically. And to the castle question, I know having come from the state and being audited by the feds, like with a revolving door, some of the agencies do actually look at the data or the application from the inside out. And so they don't want to know how are you securing from the outside in. You have to have a certain number of barriers from the inside out. And this included paper. So for instance, if you housed tax documents and they was in paper format, you had to have a locked cabinet and then a locked door, not just a locked cabinet. And so I think there are cases where people are moving to the castle. I think it's isolated, but it really depends on what data are you looking at, where are your crown jewels. I know at the state we did a year-long project where we cataloged over 1,000 applications. I sat on that committee that went out and interviewed everybody. As the applications came in, I captured all the information I needed. So we did know at the end, we could say, here's the top 10 crown jewels, because with 1,000 applications, it's hard. But we did make the business owners choose. What's your most important asset? And we forced them to do that because they did try it's everything, and we said, no, it's not. Where's your data?
And that's something, that's a great point, right? As a IT professional, as a security professional, it's not our role to identify that stuff. We have to have the conversation with the business owner
Yes.
and have them identify that stuff for us, and then we can make the appropriate recommendations on what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And how do we do that?
Yeah, you do not own the data.
Nope,
Does start there.
do not want
And
it.
the cool thing about that is, when you're doing that, you're actually doing your business impact analysis from a disaster recovery standpoint, right? Because if you have all that working together, you've got that data already, and that's going to be critical to understanding the business impact and what their expectations are in terms of uptime and what IT can actually deliver in terms of time to recovery, right?
Right, we did have to have the hard conversation of all 100 of your applications aren't coming up at the same time if we have a total network failure. So pick the one that needs to come up first. And that's a good place to start. And they don't want to hear that because they're just going to tell you, 5 minutes down, I'm like, it's total catastrophe. And you're like, hey, we're going to have a different conversation. So you do have to have the hard conversations, engage with the business, and liaison as much as you can. And get your staff good at talking to people outside of the technology room. That's the other thing I would recommend for this particular part.
Agreed. So since we are way over time here,
Sorry.
we'll go ahead and end right here. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Great
Thank you.
information, great advice.